Uno, two, tres, four.
Good morning, everyone. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. I am very happy to welcome you to this virtual lecture presented by TLDTD, a biannual journal for Filipino poets and poetry. My name is Paulo Tiausas. I co-founded TLDTD along with my friend and collaborator, the poet Likhaan back in 2020, when we launched our very first issue. I also write poetry, primarily in Tagalog, and I've been working in and around and outside the publishing industry for the majority of my professional career. Noong nagsimula ang TLDTD o Taludtod, layo namin makabuo ng espasyong magiging tahanan ng mga makatang Filipino at kanilang mga tula. Itong issue na ngayon ang TLDTD at kasabay nun, makapaglathala na kami ng lagpas 100 Filipino kumakata mula sa iba't ibang bahagi ng mundo na tumutula sa kani-kanilang wika. Bicol, Cebuano, English, Hiligaynon, Ilocano, Tawit, Tagalog, Waray at iba pa. Napakasigla ng komunidad natin ng mga Makata. Kaya, para sa ika-8 naming issue, upang mapagyabong lalo ang komunidad na ito, nagpasya kaming magpatakbo ng ilang online event bilang katuwang na pagsasalo. For today, we'll be listening to a master lecture on poetics and narrative poetry by the poet and professor MERLIE M. Alunan. She will be introduced by one of our co-editors, Adrian Medina Pregonir. After the lecture, there will be a Q&A led by another of our co-editors, Michael Carlo Villas. Just very quickly, if you're wondering about our other events, last month we held a conversation on poetry and space with poets Jan Dennis Destajo, Janice Lobo Sapigao, and Larry Ipil. Next month, we will have a poetry reading featuring some of our contributors in our regular issues. Kung interesado kayo sa aming publikasyon at sa mga nabanggit na online events tungkol sa tula, bisitahin nyo lang ang aming website sa tldtd.org o kaya naman ay sundan kami sa Facebook at Instagram. Bilang panimula, ipapakilala ko lang ang mga kasama natin ngayon. Isang aktivista at manunulat sa Hiligaynon, Kinaray-a at Filipino, si Adrian Medina Pregonir mula sa Banga, South Cotabato. Siya ay tumanggap ng pagkilala mula sa Gawad Bienvenido Lumbera, Don Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards, Gawad Rene O Villanueva at Bantugan sa Panulatan Kinaray-a. Mababasa ang kanyang mga akda sa mga journal na pampanitikan tulad ng Likhaan, the Journal of Contemporary Philippine Literature, Liwayway, Kabisdak, at iba pa. Michael Carlo Villas teaches language and literature at the Department of Arts, Languages, and Literature in the Visayas State University. His works, including poems, translations, and literary criticism, on a breadth of topics including literary history, ecocriticism, and Waray literary scholarship, have appeared in multiple books, journals, and anthologies. In 2023, he co-edited the landmark anthology Garab, an anthology of short stories in Waray. The books, poems, and works of esteemed professor, translator, and poet MERLIE M. Alunan have been recognized by the Palanca Memorial Awards for Literature, the Union ng mga Manunulat ng Pilipinas through the Gawad Alagad ni Balagtas Lifetime Achievement Award, and the National Book Awards. She is also a recipient of the Sunturn Fu Award by the Kingdom of Thailand and the Ananda Kumaraswamy Fellowship of the Satya Academy in the Republic of India. She also received the Ani Nandangal for Literary Award for Literary Arts, awarded by the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. To officially start, I'll let Adrian take the floor. Adrian, when you're ready.
Mayad nga aga, mapya mapita, na imbag nga bigat, Fiflafus. Maayong aga, halin sa South Cotabato. Ako si Adrian Medina Pregonir. Ako'y isang manunulat sa Wikang Hiligaynon at Kinaray-a. Nandito ako ngayon mula sa pinakakatimog-timugang bahagi ng Pilipinas, Southern Mindanao. Ako ay taga Banga, South Cotabato. Ngayong umaga ay isang napakalaking oportunidad na makasama ang isa sa mga haligi ng panitikan ng Pilipinas at naatasan akong ipakilala ang ating bisita na magbibigay ng kanyang lektura ngayong umaga. Siguro bago ko siya ipakikilala sa inyong lahat, magbabasa muna ako ng isang tula mula sa kanyang aklat, no? Pagdakop sa bulalakaw o iban pang mga balak. Kini ang iyahang balak. Kun unsaon pagdakop sa bulalakaw. Pilay palad sa imong pag-ata, takulahaw sa imong atubangan, ang karnerong pula, mutungha, ug unya, hinay-hinay, sa imong kiliran, mutugdon ug magpahikap sa iyang balhibo, ang nagdilaap ug idlas nga bulalakaw. Alam ng mga manunulat at eskolar na napakahalaga ng kanyang dekadang pag-iral sa heograpiya at kalibutan ng panitikan ng Pilipinas, lalo na sa panitikang Waray. Katunayan, kung itatala ang mga manunulat na mayroong napakalaking ambag sa pag-aakda na may ipinalilitaw ang pambansang kamalayan o national consciousness at karanasan, isa ako sa mga naniniwala na hindi mawawala sa mapang ito ang kanyang pangalan. Matagal ko nang naengkwentro ang mga aklat at akda niya at naging panelista rin namin siya sa Amelia La Peña Bonifacio Writers Workshop noong 2022. Minsan, napag-usapan namin ng isang manunulat mula rito sa aming rehiyon na si Manong Henry Opulencia na siya raw ang manunulat na hindi lamang manunulat kundi isang manlalakbay na ginabit-bit ang mga tinaga. Ang kanyang mga binalaybay o balak o tula o poetry sa Ingles ay hindi lamang pungpong ng mga tinaga. Ito ang mga binalak na balay ng kanyang karanasan bilang alagad ng sining, babae at ina. Kaya kung ako ang tatanungin, sumasang-ayon ako nang talaga sa blurb ni Danton Remoto sa bagong lunsad na aklat ng University of the Philippines Press na Tigum Collected Poems na isa siya sa mga matinik na Makata ng Southeast Asia. Gayunpaman, hindi lamang katahom ng mga salita ang binubuo ng mga akda niya. Isa rin siya sa mga masugid na tagapagtaguyod ng pagsusulat sa inahang dila o mother tongue. Bukod sa tanyag ang kanyang mga akda sa wikang Ingles, pati din ng karamihan na nagsusulat din siya sa Cebuano, Waray, Kinaray-a, na kanyang unang wika na binanggit niya sa kanyang Like a Song Without Words, at iba pang wika na kanyang isinalin at naging matagumpay na mga aklat. Bilang tagasalin at anthologist, naging makasaysayan at mahalagang sipatin din ang kanyang sigasig sa pagtitipon ng mga akda mula sa Kabisayaan, katulad ng makasaysayang antolohiya na Susumaton, Oral Narratives of Leyte, Sa Atong Dila, Introduction to Visayan Literature, at Tinalunay, hinugpong ang mga panurat nga winaray na nagwagi sa National Book Awards mula sa Manila Critics Circle. Kung titingnan, ang Tinalunay ay isa sa mga pinakakomprehensibong koleksyon ng panitikang Waray ngayon. Ang kanyang sigasig sa pagkukumpuni upang mabuo ang ganitong mga koleksyon ay nakaangot sa kanyang pagpati na ang bansa natin ay bansa na mayroong polyphony of languages mula sa artikulo ni Sir Mike Villas at sa kanyang panawagang learn as many of these languages as we can. Siya ang dahilan kung bakit marami ring manunulat ang nagsusulat sa unang wika dahil sa mga mahahalagang workshop kung saan nagsilbi siyang guro, katulad lamang ng Iligan National Writers Workshop, Cornelio Faigao Writing Workshop, at Lamira Regional Creative Writing Workshop. Sa kanyang sipag at maibit na kahangkil bilang mambabalak o mamalaybay, siya ay nagwagi ng mga prestihiyosong gantimpala katulad ng Don Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards for Literature, Philippines Free Press Literary Award, Gawad Pambansang Alagad ni Balagtas, Lillian Jerome Thornton Award for Poetry, Home Life Centennial Prize for Poetry, Ani ng Dangal, Kampiyon ng Wika mula sa Komisyon sa Wikang Filipino, Southern Po Award mula sa Thai Ministry of Culture at napakarami pang iba. Sino ba naman ang hindi makalilimot ng kanyang mga aklat na karamihan sa atin ay napaiyak? Ako'y napahibikit ako sa iyang mga binalaybay. Katulad lamang ng kanyang mga aklat na Running with Ghosts, Heartstone, Sacred Tree, Tales of the Spider-Woman, Amina Among the Angels, ang kanyang aklat sa Cebuano na Pagdakop sa Bulalakaw, uban pang mga balak, at ang kalalabas lamang at mainit pa mula sa palimbagang UP, Igom Collected Poems. Inilarawan ng kanyang guro na si Edith Tiempo ang kanyang mga akda na distinctive artistic perception, where darkness is awareness that is often tragic and poignant, and preternatural in its knowing, where darkness is one's truth and one's becoming. Mga kaibigan, kapanulat, ating batiin ang nag-iisa, matagumpay at pinaniniwalaan ko, at marami kaming naniniwala, na magiging National Artist for Literature ng Pilipinas sa susunod na panahon, UP Professor Emeritus Ma'am MERLIE Alunan.
The introduction leaves me speechless. Thank you very much, Adrian. Yeah, I did all of the things that you mentioned, but I was just doing them in the light of my being a teacher. I've been a teacher all my life. I fed my family on my teaching, and I gained so many friends as a teacher. So the lecture that I'm going to share with you this morning springs from that fact that I began thinking of literature not as an alien, not as an alien thing, but as something from which I earned my daily living, and something which I did all my life. I wrote. Well, I did not write actually all my life. I started writing at the age of 40. And then have never stopped from that time on. So I will begin my lecture now because we are pressed for time. Okay. The creative principles that have guided my own work as a writer is inextricable from my lifelong work as a teacher of literature and creative writing. And Adrian has talked about that at length. Literature has ever been taught in this country as an adjunct to the learning of grammar. Now, you investigate the textbooks that they are using in DepEd and in CHED, and you will find out that this is true. The grammar is taught, but the literature disappears between the slots of the emphasis on language. More often than not, my classroom were filled with students who do not know what to make of a literary piece. And so there starts my own investigation as to how to make literature much more friendly field for young people to enjoy, to understand first and then to enjoy. Hence, the first order was to redeem the poem. The first order of my process was to redeem the poems from the muteness of a page and to restore it into speech. From print to its fundamental orality, a spoken piece to which one must listen in order to understand it. The inflections of voice, the rush or slowness of speech, the softness or loudness of voice reveal multiple significations, sometimes more than what we reckon. By grounding the poems as human speech, one is thus compelled to imagine or to reimagine several other elements. Who is talking in the poem? Very elementary questions, actually. Who is talking in the poem? Who is being addressed? What is the circumstances, or what are the circumstances or the context which might have prompted the speech. So very simple questions that you lay down to the students: who is talking, who is being addressed, why are they talking the way they are talking. Failure to clarify these communicative elements usually results in the failure to understand the poem. In my experience, finding the particular human voice in the poem and clarifying the communicative elements on which a poetic utterance hinges cuts the labor of entering a poem and divining what it is trying to tell us. I have had many intelligent adults who look up from reading a poem and asking in utter puzzlement, so what is it saying? There's a frame of mind in reading a poem where they want to understand what it is really saying, whether it's teaching something or not, or what is it trying to say to us. It forgets the fact that a poem is primarily a human utterance and must be understood from that communicative level. So this concept is really actually very elementary. Human speech never occurs in a vacuum. People speak within a context of circumstances. The words could be addressed to someone, such as in that favorite elocutory poem by Whitman, "O Captain, my Captain, thy careful trip is done." It's addressed to a captain who is already dead. Or the poet or his persona is doing a soliloquy, such as Hamlet's "To Be or Not to Be," where he is talking to himself. It's important to understand this. Or it could be a conversation between a spider and a fly. Although I maybe remember that poem, "Will you walk into my parlor?" says the spider to the fly, and so on. In this particular poem, the fly never talks. So he's silent all the while. It's only the spider making these amorous propositions. There are poems which simply tell a story, and we are the fortunate or unfortunate audience, such as we see in Robert Frost's "Stopping by Woods," which leaves us puzzling what it is all about. These are fairly popular examples and within easy reach of our memory. Where there is speech, there surely must be a speaker. And that is the second mystery we must unravel next. We turn to a few examples to find out how important it is to discover in one's exploration of a poem, of a poetry performance, who the speaker is. So poetry is a speech, therefore it must have a speaker. Poetry is a human speech, therefore that speech is spoken out of a particular context by a particular speaker. Allen Ginsberg, who flourished in the 60s, he is a beatnik. He refers to a poem from medieval England. He considers that particular poem the best poem in the English language. And the poem goes this way. "O western wind, when wilt thou blow, that the small rain down can rain? Christ, that you are in my arms, and I in my bed again." Now, Ginsberg thinks that is the best poem in the English language. Times we may have uttered the same words, as simple and as straightforward as this poem, without being aware that we are actually, already speaking poetry. So poetry is not very far from our human speech once we understand that there is a speaker caught in a particular circumstance or in a particular situation. In 1949, W.H. Auden wrote Lullaby. 1949, as we know, is the time of the Second World War, and the world was in shambles. Lullaby is a contemplation of the brevity of human life, the ills and grossness of society, the individual propinquity to evil and sin. The lover, who is the speaker in the poem, says to himself, and perhaps to his sleeping beloved, "Lay your sleeping head, my love, human, on my faithless arm." Time and fevers burn away individual beauty from thoughtful children, and the grave proves the child ephemeral. That is an address. That is a person talking to a beloved. It's not Odin. It's a human being who could be one of us. The lover is not addressing a faceless public like the reader. He is talking more to himself and to the beloved, peaceful and trusting, asleep in his arms, about the threats against love in a troubled world. As if to comfort himself, he says towards the end, "But in my arms still break of day, let the living creature lie, mortal, guilty, but to me be entirely beautiful." In an even earlier poem, 1909, entitled "The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock" by T.S. Eliot, the first line lays down the dramatic key of the poem. "Let us go then, you and I. Let's go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient, etherized upon a table." The speaker is a certain J. Alfred Prufrock, a pretentious, wishy-washy, shy, and painfully self-conscious fellow, inviting someone to a tryst. But in the whole poem, that tryst never happens because, as Prufrock himself knows, there is nowhere to go. Every human action is futile, and nothing is worth doing in this world. After several fits and starts, and no progress ever, Prufrock says to himself towards the end of the poem, I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. These four examples from Anglophone poetry show a voice as the poetic anchor from earlier times to the modern, from the medieval to Prufrock, and even to our day. Now, what about us Pinoys? I always try to include reflections on Filipino poetry in some of my critical explorations. And so let us reflect on two farewell songs famous in the Visayas and popular in the Visayas even now. There's Ahay Tuburan. Adrian must be familiar with this. A young woman is addressing a you, ikaw, saying that like water flowing endlessly in a stream, she too must leave, no matter how well esteemed she is as a guest. She must obey her parents' call for her to depart. She promises to return, but only after a very, very long time. This is the text of one stanza of the poem. Ang bilin ni nanay, ang bilin ni tatay, magpahilayo ako sa inyong kalipay. Bisan anong estimasyon, bayaan taanay, balikon lang ugaling sa tiempong madugay. The other farewell song is Dandansui. I think all of us are familiar with Dandansui, but I am I am really, I find this poem really very interesting. The song goes this way. Dandansuy bayaan ta ikaw, makadto ako sa payaw. Ugaling kon ikaw hidlawon, ang payaw imo lang lantawon. Dandansuy kon imo apason, bisan tubig, hindi magbalon. Ugaling kon ikaw hawon, sa dalan magbubun-bubon. Nora Honor has a song, a version of this song. A woman is telling Dandansoy that she is going to Payao. In the second verse, she says, if he wants to follow her, he must leave behind everything. Not even water must he bring. If he becomes thirsty in his journey, he would dig himself, or he could just, dig himself a well along the way. In these two songs, as in Auden and Eliot and that unknown medieval soldier, we note the essential narrative property of poetry. The utterance presupposes a speaker involved in a dramatic situation or action, a story or a narrative. The story may not be explicitly stated, but it is strongly inferable. That is to say, the poem or the utterance provides the clues to enable us to infer the circumstances before, during, or even after the speech. This is very much akin to the inferences we make in daily life as we interact with one another, gauging situations despite the unspoken details beyond our words. What I'm trying to show is, because this is a method of teaching that I've been using for most of my teaching life, what I am trying to convince the students is to think of poetry as not an alien thing, but something that grows organically out of their own lives. And so once you see a poem as as a speech that comes from an individual caught in a particular circumstance, in other words, the narrative root of poetry, then they will not be alienated from it. They will learn to befriend it and to make it, to become more friendly to it also. How do we make inferences? We are clued in our inferences by tone, by the tone of the speaking. So it's something built into language and built into the psychology into our psychology as we speak, because we never speak out without a context. When we speak, it's always because there is a situation that prompts the speech. We are clued in by tone, the tone of the speaking voice, bodily postures, facial expressions, gestures, social relationships in actual life. So we are doing this in everyday life. We should be able to transfer that skill, into the reading of poetry. My generation, because I belong to a generation that's already on the way out, was highly dependent on print. Unlike today, where visual and oral stimuli combine easily in communicative practices. The thing about print, though, and I think this was part of the difficulty, the thing about print, though, is it could make us believe that the mute lines of text on the page is the poem. The visuality of text on a page predisposes us to forget that language is fundamentally oral. Those squiggles on a page are mere representations of sound. For a poem to come alive, it must be redeemed from the mute visuality of a page and restored to orality. Thus, it is really important to read a poem aloud for the poet who writes and for the reader. Very often, I have observed that some poems it's very difficult to read them because they do not spring from that awareness of the orality of text. So the poem to come alive, it must be redeemed from the mute visuality of a page and restored to orality. I suspect that the difficulty we experience in the reading and writing of poetry spring from our neglect of the essential orality of language and hence of poetry. Although print dominates most of what we know about poetry today, we must remember that poets actually spring from a line of shamans, chanters, and bards who spoke or sang the stories and lays of their people. I don't think that the role of poets have changed much. It's still very much that way, despite the fact that our lives have become more complicated. Dandan Soy is a firm and final farewell with no anger or sadness in the tone. We may infer her reasons, and we may infer also how Dansoy must be free-feeling as these words are being told to him. Would our inferences be correct? It is in the nature of inferences to be neither absolutely right nor absolutely wrong. But that is also reality. Reality always has multiple facets. We may infer the character of the speaker, whether it is male or female, and the relationship between the speaker and addressees, especially in the second verse. Dandansoy kun imo apason, bisan tubig hindi magbalon, ugaling kun ikaw uhawon sa dalan magubun-bubun. In its economy and subtle overlay of contextual and psychological possibilities, Dandansoy is a fine model of poetic excellence. To my mind, at least, never mind. If you want to argue with me, I will not argue with you. Go on with what you believe. I suspect also that Dandansoy has been ignored, in our discussions or native poems, the poems of the folk, the poems in our languages have been ignored in our critical review of poetry because we have always looked down on our mother tongues and on the productions of our mother tongues and preferred to read and to understand in a foreign language. To us, Visayans, for example, Filipino is a foreign language. It's an intrusion into our own culture. But since it is there, I believe we must continue learning it and using it. Dandansoy occurs across the Kabisayan. There are versions in Hiligaynon, in Cebuano, and Waray, and maybe even in the Romblon and Palawan areas. Okay, let's go on. The speaker or persona, the appropriate literary term, is the strongest human presence in the poem. The more complex a poem is, the more necessary it is for a reader to infer its narrative underpinning from the voice of the persona. A short passage in Tigom may be cited. This is a poem by itself, a mere 4-line poem. No? An echo passing. A name almost forgotten. So it's come to this. Did he say he'd return? Memory triggers a complex awareness. How much had been forgotten? How much had been lost? And what is to happen next? And then the open-ended question, did he say he'd return? A confusion of emotions arise. Anger, annoyance, irony, anguish, anxiety, sarcasm, even regret. The poem is spare and unadorned, almost matter of fact, and could have been spoken by anyone in a similar situation. It mentions none of the effects we have listed, yet it projects this multivalent quality. It never mentions anger or anything like that, and yet we feel it. We can we can infer it projects all these qualities. Who is the speaker? A lover who has had to deal with a broken promise and now has to live with the consequences. The real poem here is not even in the words. The words are merely channels to the universe of the unspoken, the vocabulary of feeling for which no words have yet been invented. The real poem is in the silence that follows it. The real poem is on these echoes of these feelings. That is why I tend to think that the poem on the poem on the page becomes a poem only when it is read and felt by its reader. The poem happens actually in the reader. The completion of the poem happens in the reader. The reader completes the poem when it too becomes her experience. Identifying the poetic voice and implicit story in the utterance is an effective wedge to open up a poem. Listen to the voice. Why is the speech being spoken? How is the listener figured in the speech? Through the ages, poets have even spoken to us through many voices. Poets have even talked to us in God's very own words. Indeed, much of our faith is grounded in the words, the stories that poets claim to have been dictated to them by God or his angels. It proves the power of words to rule. But let us not go into that because it would lead us to complications that we need not go into at this point. Now let's just say that narrativity is a principle for my own poetic practice. Maybe some poems have their own, some poets have their own principles, but for me, narrativity is the backbone of my own poetic practice. Back in the days, the late 60s, which must seem to many of you like the age of Moses, I sat in the classes of Edith Tiempo. When tackling a difficult poem, we would throw in all sorts of wild observations about it just to have something to say, just to keep the air moving. The Magos Edith would gently guide us back with his core questions. Who speaks in the poem? What is the tone of the speech? What is the communicative situation, or what is the communicative context? What is the story behind the speech? Is there a story? To whom is the story being told? Once these elements are clarified from the poem's givens, then the poem unfolds itself very easily. Then the lapses, the contradictions, the gaps also become evident once viewed from the logic of the story. It is a typical formalist approach to reading and writing. It grounded us in our time on the notion that one, writing is a conscious and rational process, and that two, the poet is in control of that process. It has become customary to scoff at this procedure as being perhaps too simplistic. On the other hand, human experience is beyond simplification, and language, the medium we use to tame experience, is a slippery eel. It's a slippery, unmanageable eel that escapes the puny grasp of our minds. The poet actually needs a buttress on which to hold the poem together. The narrative practice so far has not failed me. That's only when I have known, but that is only when one has chosen how the story will be told. How the story will be told. Back in the 80s, when my children were just starting to discover themselves and the world around them, I was also just stumbling my way to understand how a poem works. We lived for one summer in a small room at the UPTC guest house when the campus was just at that time close to being a raw land with lots of trees and tall grass, alive with snakes, frogs, rats, and the shrill cries of birds. The two boys spent their day hunting, exploring the grasslands. They would go around with their slingshots. At lunch, they would come together. The boys would talk about their adventures, the nests they had raided, the birds they had hurt or killed, the ones they had hit and killed. They would also talk about, the game they had eaten, because they would clean the bird and eat it right there. They would build a fire and they would roast the bird. I listened to their uncertain voices that mingled pity for the lives they had wasted, but also the triumph of the kill. It was their rite of passage, their discovery of their power to deal death. At night, they sleep with the same intensity of their innocence that drove them in the daytime to roam the dense grassland and harry the birds. I wanted to write a poem. I saw the mother mourning the loss of innocence, accepting the inevitability of this loss, the inception of guilt. But I did not want this poem to be that of a mother. I wanted it to be the poem of the boys. The mother's sentiment was legitimate but predictable. It did not deal with the worried voices at dinner time, the strange interplay of grief, guilt, and triumph. The poem wrote itself, in a manner of speaking, 7 years after. So it took me 7 years to write this poem. The boys had grown up and we were no longer in the UP campus but in Silliman. I heard in my mind's ears what seemed to me the proper way to speak the poem. The persona identified itself, an observer at once remote but intimate, like a magus or a soothsayer, one who knows things in secret, the end and beginning of things, and the life path that everyone must tread. She, and I can't explain why it must be a she, watches the boys' action and knows what goes on in their dreams. She sees their violation of natural life. In poem 1, entitled Dreamer, she enters the boys' dreams and sees how even in dreams they dream of the hunt. In his sleep, he prowls the dark bone cave, nerves astir with wings whirring, feathers ruffling in the heat, roused birds dickering, soaring swift over the grass. In poem 2, entitled Sling Wilder, she watches the boys in the daytime, prowling in the woodland, dealing death with their hands. All night long, had he not exercised death's swift ceremonies? Under the stricken trees now, let him rip the green, the raw fruit from the branches. Let him break their livid wombs on the parched trail, laughter in his throat like a jar of clay shattering with every fallen prey. Let him tame it, string the stilled, bloodied birds around his neck. Let him know the smell of it. Let the charred fragrance swirl in his tongue, the sweet, the sharp taste of the kill. But this too is a necessary phase that no one can stop. The power to kill is a necessity to survival as the power to let live. In the third poem, entitled Goddess, the persona delivers the poem's epiphany. To tame the heedless, teach him fear, teach him sorrow, latent to every season's spawning of egg and seed, between daylight and dusk, all beyond the will and death. She rules, joy of ripeness, free to no one's invention, a leaf's slow spindrift downward dance to the cradling earth. Till his doom, what he sees or hears, looking up with eyes full of smoke, his nose twitching to the fragrant burnt game, he could never, would never, ever tell. But listen, how he blabbers, and those tears, those tears. It is while writing this poem that I appreciated creative value of persona. This is where it started. The importance that I pay to the persona. And as I write this paper, I read this paper before all of us, all of you. I am aware of doing several different things at the same time. I am writing a part of my life story from which sprung the germ of a poem, the long process of distilling poetry out of that lump of one's experiences, the mediation of form or design that brought the poem to life. The nights of that summer of '84 are still vivid in my mind. It was the season I had decided to end a dysfunctional marriage. The children and myself were totally displaced from the old life. We were struggling to rise above the shambles of our old life. But they were tough kids. They rallied to the new arrangements and carried on with their childhood without skipping a beat. This was part of the deal of that poem. I could not write. Part of the deal of the poem I could not write. I was well aware of what poetry is not. It is not confession. It is not an outlet for rage. It is not a ploy for sympathy. Poetry is not the effect of inspiration, as I have been frequently asked. Certainly, those were the most uninspiring days of my life, but it was not the reason why I could not write that poem. The reason was I could not hear how or who was to be the poem's voice. Any poet sources the materials for his art from his life, just as a sculptor would hack and chisel and polish a piece of wood to create a figure. The poet also labors at the scraps of her days, waiting for voice that would speak it. It may be the same way an architect would stand on a piece of ground and imagine his edifice rising against the backdrop of hills and trees and other structures around it. How he will raise it from the ground, calculating the depth of its foundation, the weights and heights of metal and stone, defining balance, strength, stability, endurance, and space and its uses. Like the sculptor or the architect, that poet has her own way to get about her task. I stumbled into it 7 years after that long, hot summer of '84. I have a few more thoughts to share about it. One of these is how persona positions the reader vis-a-vis the text. Is the reader the direct addressee? Is she an eavesdropper to a conversation? Is the reader invited to listen to someone's inner speech as a soliloquy? Is one listening to a dialogue with a virtual fourth wall in which his presence is not recognized? Or is she being made witness to an event or a situation in which her sympathy or empathy is being sought. Once she understands her place in the communication or in the communicative situation, she can then participate actively in the poem unfolding. In poems of a season, what role is assigned to the reader? The reader overhears, as it were, a soliloquy. She becomes an indeterminate listener. Perhaps the reader's presence is invoked to the last as though she were being drawn into a conversation. But listen how he blubbers, and those tears. I have learned from repeated blunders the importance of distancing oneself from one's material. The persona lays the proper balance of distance or intimacy between the writer and her material. The personal view is often blighted and seldom offer a clear sense of things. It is easier to write another person's story than it is to write one's own. Strangely enough, as I have discovered, the farther one goes away from oneself and write as if oneself doesn't exist, the closer one moves into the intimacy with the subject and with the reader. The I, as I use them in my poetry, is not the I, myself. The true I, myself, that is, as a poet. The true I is a liar and a sinner obsessed with subterfuge and self-protection. So very untrustworthy. In poetry, which is also found in Pigom, the I is a woman twinned with a sickly, bratty, invalid sister that she has to look after, the you in the poem. So it's like the I is talking to the you. The you is the sister who is a brat and an invalid. She is talking to the sister, telling her story or telling their story as the reader listens in. My hair turned white, pondering to your whims. I grew weak, kneed, lugging you around, a dead weight to bear. My skin yellowed, and your aches and pains. And so, what was I to do then? Born, as they say, to be one of your own. It got so bad, I hardly know, when I took to biting, chewing, gnawing at you while you thrashed about, sucking and licking your juices as you ranted, till I got you trimmed to a finger size. This is a story of benevolent cannibalism. The stronger sister eventually swallows up her weaker but percipient twin, gaining control over her. Or is it the other way round? Is it the other sister who got control of her when she finally became part of her, when she was swallowed? Anyway, this is how the story ends. You melted and drained down my throat, so that now I hardly feel your weight. I can tell anymore whose voice breaks through my speech, or how I gained the other's forked tongue to command sorcery from the bright side of the dark of the moon. This is the story of how it is to live with poetry. It is part of you, you love it and hate it. You struggle with it, you struggle against it, but yet you cannot live without it. You just have to find a way to live with it, but never in peace, never in peace. There is a voice and a language for every kind of story. I call this design. My mentors called it craft. I have shown you a few of what I have done. The poet hears these voices everywhere, as I have mentioned earlier, almost as if she hears the voice of God in her head. And if God is silent, she could conjure him amid the noise of a marketplace, the roaring warplanes, the howling storms. And so long as the poet goes on making her poems, writing the songs, telling the stories in as many human voices as she could conjure, so long will humanity persevere, as in the last lines of poetry. Listen, that song out there, that's you and I, wanting the sun, forever gold on the skin, calling back rivers to where they first sprung, craving mangoes past their seasons, avid as ever for this vile, vile air. So you complain that it steals your beauty and corrupts my truth with questions. Well then, my irascible twin, enough of this petulance. So long as this singing lasts, so long shall we thrive, you and I, beautiful forever and deathless. Thank you.
Thank you, Mom, sharing so much with us, sharing so much of your wisdom and your thought. It's truly an honor. I'm sure that, like me, we all have responses. We're all processing so much in the Q&A. So, Michael, ready?
Ay buntag sa inyong tanan. Si Michael na idaghang pangutana.
Good morning. Good morning, MERLIE. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, this is not actually the first time I sat in your lectures. There are things that you said in the lecture that really stood out to me. One of them is the fact that you began your lecture quoting Ginsberg, Eliot. It speaks much about the type of education you received. And I remember in one of our conversations, you said that if you were given the chance to take a literature course, you would take the same literature course all over again. In your preface to Tigum, you mentioned that you majored in the Romantic period. I think we also talked about this in one of our conversations. So maybe the audience would like to know.
Edith majored in Romanticism. Edith majored in Romanticism in, I think, Denver University, where she took her doctoral degree. So when I became her students early on, in the first semester, I think she already encouraged me, Dai, mag-romantic, ang imong area of concentration, which means that I had to read, I had to go through a list of the writers of the Romantic period and take a test on that, take an exam on that. It's independent study. So that's how I became somewhat like Edith. Although Edith, she is my goddess. She will never be less than that.
And I'm curious about how this education later shaped the decisions you made as a poet, because I'm sure it had some bearing on the manner in which you used language later on in your craft.
Yeah. The value of that particular curriculum I went through in Silliman is that it took a historical view of things. So when you deal with literature from a historical point of view, you necessarily take in other elements that created, that influenced the history of that period and how history has influenced the shape of literature in that age. So it taught me to look around me, see what's going on outside, see what's going on in the field of commerce, politics, the daily news, economics, and relate it to what's happening in a particular vicinity. Like, for example, I got curious when I arrived in Leyte about the literary, the literary record, or what do Leyteños have by way of literature. And so I was looking for writers in Waray. The same way that, for example, the body of Cebuano literature is pretty much intact. You can read from the earliest times to the present. You can go to the University of San Carlos, and there are these materials to read. When I came to Leyte in 1980, I was looking for the same things, and I discovered that there wasn't any. Of course, there was in the university, Divine Word University, but they were archival in nature and not quite easily accessible to the ordinary reader. So I looked around and tried to decipher, tried to understand why, this thing is happening, why Waray literature is missing in the life of the people, even in academia, even in UP. I was talking to my professors, to my colleagues, and they said, Waray na nagsusurat, hawin na raya na, Waray na good. Pero may nagsusurat, pero kuan lahira, baga Waray man hira honor, Waray man na may miling haira, nagsusurat lahira kay karuyag nila magsurat. And the representative of Waray poetry in those days was the DYBL Siday. That's the only thing that was going on. Yeah. And some people still know the great poets like Lucente and Macabenta and Ranchera. They knew them. They know the names, but the materials are nowhere to be found. There's nothing to be found at all. Waray good ka nakikitaan. Ang mga pamilya gihapon, tatapigan ini nga mga materials. They guard these materials very, very closely and are very worried about letting it out or sharing it with other people. Fearful that they would be, get taken from them. They would be plagiarized or claimed and taken away from them, stolen back. So the curriculum helped me to see literature not as an independent event or phenomenon apart from life. It was really very much part of the life of the nation. So political, economic, all of that, they influence the growth, the consumption, or the death of literature. That's why I say I'd go over that course again. Maybe the modes of analysis will not be the same modes of analysis that we followed in the Tiempo time, but still it pays to know the past so that you can understand the future. I think that much I can say.
So, based on what you just pointed out, it's unfair to actually label that point in our literary history as American New Critics, American New Criticism, because based on the way you describe it, that's not American New Criticism anymore. The American New Critics did not care about history, did not care at all about history. They only cared about what was going on in the text. So it was a different kind of formalism, I should say. No, but that's me already talking as
Yeah,
as
and
someone
it's
who's
me
been
also
doing
talking.
literary history.
It's me talking about my own experience, and perhaps the level of emphasis I placed upon myself on discovering, the philosophy and the history of this and that, and the relationship of, for example, the church, the influence of the church on the growth of literature. There was a time when I was teaching survey of English literature, which was a necessary course for the Com Arts program here in UP, I would sometimes choose to teach it by looking at the development of literature in England through the influence of the church. You know, you can just pick on one aspect of the life and then follow it through that, and it will lead you to the broader, to the broader vision of literature. It will lead you to politics. It will lead you to the wars between the kings or among the kings, and so on and so forth. But you see, while I was studying English literature this way at that time, because that was the emphasis, I think I was also learning how to apply the methods that I was encountering to our own literature, which I think we have not done quite enough of, understanding our literature through the eyes of our political development, or through the vision of our political development, for instance. So that was what I was learning. You learn this and you don't necessarily apply it on the same methods. You use the method to explore other areas. Yeah.
You
Is that
mentioned you mentioned that narrativity would describe your poetics. It's yours. It's your technique. What perhaps our audience would like to know is, you maybe a little background first on how you got into this technique. What perhaps what was not mentioned in the lecture was that you studied fiction in Silliman. You did not study poetry, and that your thesis was on fiction. It's a very interesting title, the transformation of setting into character.
I thought the ghost of that dissertation, the ghost of that thesis will no longer haunt me, but you keep raising it up. So I'm curious now to discover what I myself have written there, because I've forgotten most of it, Mike. But yes, I did study. I did study fiction, and I thought I wanted to be a fictionist. But I do not know how. I don't even know at what point I began writing more poetry than fiction. And then it turned out, as you critics have noticed, that my poems are mostly grounded on fiction, grounded rather on the story, on the narrative. And I think you're right, because, well, just as I explained in my presentation, once you have a speaker who is not yourself, but a creation of your inventive, of the poetic invention. It's a creation. So this speaker is a person. When he speaks out of a context, out of a dramatic context. And that dramatic text has to be rather explored. It has to have, the classical beginning, middle, and end. The drama with the problem, and then the resolution of the problem, and then the conclusion. I mean, that kind of structuring, very classic, very very boring maybe for some people, but I think this is the way that I link with readers, because to my mind, the poem is always a human speech. It's always a human speech. If I make a stone, for example, talk, or if I make a tree talk, or if I make a waste garbage can talk, that garbage can talking using a human language is talking about the human, the human experience, the human predicament. So one cannot stay away from the narrative. But it's probably because that is the kind of poems I write. I never write away from human experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it also somehow connects. The human being immediately connects with the story,
It's
not
always a
with
story. Mm.
not with an abstraction or not with
Yeah.
an idea. It has to be a story. We listen to stories, but we don't read scientific papers, except of course if you're a scientist. So um, part of what you mentioned in your lecture, and this is also one interesting concept I see that I have that's consistent in your generation of writers, is you would mention patience as part uh, of the design of your of the design of the poem. So in other words, it's the waiting part. Most of the time we wait, we have to wait for the right word, we have to wait for the right story, and then um in fact Ricardo de Ungria called this a passionate patience. That was the title of his book.
Yes, I
Um,
remember that book.
so yeah, maybe you can tell our audience also on this process of waiting. What exactly goes on? You said that uh, it took you 7 years to write poems.
One poem, Poems of a
Yes.
Season. Yes.
There are poems like that. From my own experience, there are poems like that. It takes years. So maybe the audience is curious to know what goes on within that time frame while that poem is being written. Is there no writing going on, and so on? So
If you write many other things, you write many other things. You make love, you cook, you eat, you go around, you teach, you quarrel with your husband. Life goes on as you wait. But the poem is like somewhere in the back burner of your mind. It's just there. It's just there. And what are you really waiting for? Many things. I waited for that poem. I waited for the speaker to come. I cannot imagine who will speak the poem. I cannot be, because if the mother talks, if I talk, and if the mother talks, diba, you expect the mother to talk in a certain way. That would be the general expectation, and that's really what's going to happen. So I didn't want to do that because para namang cliche lahat ang lalabas kung ganon ang gagawin ko, di ba? Now I'm nag-Tagalog na ako. The words would be predictable and the mother's voice is boring, di ba? Who cares? Mothers will say that all the time. And there are loads and loads of that already around. So I just kept it in the back burner of my mind until, I don't know what comes first, whether the words come first. Some lines and phrases might have come first, and then they would be spoken in a particular tone of voice. Maybe I can almost hear the voice, the raspiness. I can hear that. The sound of it as though it were coming from a huge distance, all these things. And then it comes slowly until it becomes really persistent. And so you take it by the hand. Kaptan mo na gud hiya. I mean, figuratively, of course, because you cannot hold on to something that does not really exist, except in your imagination. Kaptan mo na gud hiya, then buuhon mo na hiya. Create a history for this particular voice. Where does it come from? Who is it from? How do you relate to this particular voice? How would the kids relate? How would the children, the boys relate? How would the experience relate? What will this voice say? And then it becomes clearer and clearer as you go on. And then you sit down and write. And then maybe you don't like the first draft. So it will wait another 10 years before you go back to the draft and then clean it up again. The poems of a season was like that. That's how it took life. Slowly, by pieces, first in the mind, before it went into paper. And I think that's the most difficult poem I really wrote. I mean, the most difficult poem to write for me. It may not be a very difficult poem to understand.
Difficult because it's too intimate, it's too close.
It was too intimate. Besides, yes, that's why I did not like the mother's voice, because it was too intimate. It was too much me. And me, I'm boring. You know, I'm boring. I'll say all the usual things. I have to look for someone who is not boring. Who to my mind is not boring anyway. So it's up to the audience to judge whether this particular voice is right for the poem or not. But I don't know. At least it brings the poem to a different plane. It's a different plane altogether. It's not a poem about relationship between mother and child. It is a poem about humans and nature.
I think I asked the question because in an interview with Ibis Tiempo, Margie Vasco and Edna Sopanto Manlapas asked that similar question. What happens during that period of waiting? And then they have this interesting word. There was this interesting word that came out of that conversation. It's the word gestation.
Yeah,
when
gestation. Oh,
Ibis
gestation.
Tiempo said,
It uses that
like it's like you nurture the poem. You don't let it go out. Otherwise, it's going to be premature. So you have to wait. So that's an interesting concept in your poetics, just patience. And there's another interesting concept also, which we already mentioned, distance. We need distance. Now you mentioned something you mentioned that when you describe the persona, the persona lays the proper distance or intimacy between the writer and her material. So I read this as, to be intimate with your material, you must have distance from it. In what sense do you speak of distance in the creation of your poems, in the crafting of your poems?
This is easy to explain in the light of one poem I wrote, whose title eludes me now, but this is a poem about a woman undergoing acupuncture. And as she's lying there, this is me, because I did undergo acupuncture several times, many times. And the acupuncturist became my friend. So while he is putting his needles on my back, we would be exchanging views, and we would be kidding each other afterwards. When you do acupuncture, you actually completely disrobe. You remove all your clothes, and you're lying on. First, you lie on your front, and then you lie on your back. When you lie on your front, he will put a row of needles all the way to your heel. And then after an hour, he turns you over and he puts needles all over you, from your head down to your foot, down to your toes. A very intimate procedure. And so here is a woman undergoing acupuncture, and for a while I wrote the poem as an I. And then it came to me, if I make this a she, will it be better? There is a difference between I and she. And I eventually decided to use she as a mode of distancing. Now, from that mode, the she can indulge in thoughts that the I would not want to reveal. You get it, Mike? The thing about distancing and intimacy, and how that choice creates the balance between how much you want to reveal, how much you can reveal when you are using the I and yourself, as the speaker, than when you are using someone else, a she, and the indeterminate she is just anyone. It doesn't reflect on you as the writer.
In my own practice, I would need another voice to speak my own emotional engagement with
Yes.
the thing, di ba? You have to have that. Otherwise, what would come out would not be poetry, but would be something else.
Self-confession.
Yes, it would be
Self-flagellation.
confession.
Could be there.
Yes.
It would be
Mm.
confession, self-flagellation, searching for pity, all of those things which we do not want poetry to be. So choosing a persona to speak the poem toughens up the poem and guards you from being sentimental. The tendency to be sentimental is very strong in poetry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
It toughens up the poetry.
And I think this distance is necessary, especially if the material for your poem is your life or lives. No, the material for poetry is really lives,
It's
not just
really like,
our. So that's how close we are to the material. So distance will be necessary.
So a good choice of voice creates that distance for the poet, for the act of making poetry. Yeah.
One of the things that I have not asked you in many of our conversations. Yes, no, I'm sure this is safe. No, I thought about this question. It's an observation it's not only my observation, but many of us who love your poetry. The theme of it seems to me that family life is one of your favorite themes in your poems. So you're right about I was talking to during the launching of Tigum. Was it Tigum collected poems, di ba? Sir Nino asked me to read one of your poems, and I said I chose a poem without the name of any of the children because they might, they usually would go out see, they were when I told Ate May and about this, she was laughing, so where it's a theme in your poetry. I'm wondering if it's a material. Does your okay? How would I frame this? Do you, as a poet, do you choose your material, or does it just land on your lap and say, "This is going to be the material I'm going to use for my poetry"?
Both ways.
Both ways.
Both ways. It chooses you, and then you choose it. I wonder if you're familiar with the poem Invisible. Invisible. Well, it talks about the people of the Philippines are invisible to their leaders. They do not know how much the people are suffering because they cannot see. They are invisible. That is a poem I chose to write. And I write it from the view of myself as among the invisibles. Yeah.
I think this is a poem you wrote recently.
This is fairly recent, maybe 2 years ago, or 3 years ago.
I could remember. I remember the poem. Like you shared it with us. It was like we were in the middle of. We were during. It was during the election season, I think.
Yeah, about that time. Oh.
Yeah, about the time. Yeah. So it's sometimes the it's we choose the material that we're going to use in our poetry, and it's also true the other way around. I think I will end with this question. Um, if I will be asked to describe your poetics in one word, I would immediately say home. Language occupies a large part of that terrain you call home. I have the Kabisayan in mind now, and this is keystone. This is the keystone of your creative and scholarly work, as you said in one of your poems, which you have read now, poetry, calling back rivers to where they first sprung.
Um,
I am tempted to ask you the question, how would you know? But I also admire how you take the concept of home as tentative, something you never really arrive at, so that home is wherever you find yourself in the map, something you can claim or make, but whose there-ness, whose materiality, however, forever elides and escapes. Can you comment on uh, this concept of home? It's close also to family. It's close to nation, in fact, because in one of your papers you said that the nation is within latitudes of intimacy. It's not something remote. So this concept of home is really, for me, this is what summarizes. It's like uh, with the risk of sounding reductive, it's what uh, describes your poetics. Could the tentativeness also of this concept come from the fluidity of language, being someone who who lived in different parts of the Visayas? You are the quintessential, I would say. If Erin de Alboro would say you are the quintessential Bisdak, I would say you are the quintessential archipelagic poet, even before the word archipelagic became a byword.
came a byword criticism, yes. Um, home. Yes,
Yes.
I've always been kind of preoccupied with home, being really homeless, because being homeless in the sense of not being able to identify myself as being from a particular place. I have lost that, Mike. I was born in Ilongga. I spoke Kinaray-a. I lived in Mindanao. I lived in Cebu. I lived in Bohol. I lived in Negros. And then finally got grounded in Leyte. Unfortunate Leyte. So in all of these wanderings, I was always the stranger in the playground. And if you don't speak the language of that place, you will forever be a stranger. When my father was, a young man and just finished from the war. Remember, I was born in 1946. The war ended, no, 43. The war ended in 1946. In the 50s, the war was not even 10 years old. The war, and the independence from the Philippines was not even 10 years old. And we would used to sing, "God bless America, land of the free." We used to sing that in school. So all of those contributed to the sense of not being at home anywhere. Always a stranger, always the outsider. Eventually make friends, but I've been in Leyte for these many years, and I think I will be buried in Leyte. My ashes will be spread somewhere in hopefully the San Juanico Strait. But I still don't feel really at home here. I don't really know what home is, what it is to be really at home, to know your santos, to know your neighbors, to celebrate the fiestas, to have all the relatives around you. I don't have the luxury of that in all my life. So home is a fascination for me. But throughout these many years, I have discovered I have come to accept one thing. The closest to home that we will ever have is language. Language describes all that you know about all the places that you have lived in and all the people that you love, the people that you know, and all those who hate you and all those that you also hate back in return. All that you know, all that you may know of home is in language. Therefore, wherever you go, that language is your home. Even if you go to America, the language you carry with you, the old language, that will be your home. And to me, it's very important that Filipinos really read the literature written by their own people, because then it deepens their sense of home. That's the importance of literature that I think our government educational system has not quite attended to. There is still a large emphasis on learning English and English literature, and very, very scarce materials on our very own language, our very own literature. And when I talk about literature, I talk about the folk literature also, and the literature that are written by our own people in their own languages. We have to know that. That is home. That is how we learn to love the things that are dear to us and keep them alive in our minds wherever we go. So language, that is your final home. You bring it with you even to your death, I think. And so that's why I keep urging people, write in your mother tongue, write in your mother tongue, read in your mother tongue. For something I have not done myself, because unfortunately in the Philippines, it's so hard to access materials in the mother tongue. Diba? It's still very, very difficult. And there is not much help anywhere else. But in the efforts of a few, you might say misguided individuals who insist with me that language is very important. So I think this is my final message to our listeners and our writers.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Merly. I think we can go return to Pao
Yes.
for the
Yes.
synthesis.
Thank you. Thank you. So, wow. I was a bit teary-eyed just now. So I think this discussion, it feels like, that high point in all of the literary or poetry classes that you've attended in your lifetime. That's what it feels like to me. So with much gratitude, thank you again to Professor MERLIE Alunan, to our co-editors, Adrian and Michael, for being here. Thank you to our technical producer, Glenn Lopez. And thank you to my co-editor, Nikay Paredes. And thank you, our dear audience, for poetry. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Privilege and an honor to be able to share my thoughts. Thank you.
Dandan suy, inom sila, tubanoy. Mo, tuba.